The text came at 8:17 on a Friday night, 4 words long, and it turned my blood to ice water. "Mom, the porch light is broken." I didn't scream. I didn't call his name. I stood up from the couch where I'd been folding my uniform, and every instinct I'd spent 20 years training kicked into place at once. My daughter was in danger, and the man who put her there had no idea what he'd just woken up. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. For 2 years, my ex-husband believed I was the fragile one in our marriage. He told our friends I couldn't handle pressure. He told the judge I was emotionally unstable. He had absolutely no idea who he married. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 47 years old, and until 18 months ago, I served as a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserve with 2 decades behind me in intelligence work and crisis management. I've stood in rooms where the wrong decision cost lives. I've learned to keep my hands steady when everything inside me wants to shake. None of that mattered to Daniel Whitmore. To him, I was just the quiet woman who signed paperwork and never talked about her job. That Friday night, I was in my small apartment outside Alexandria, Virginia, the kind of place I chose specifically because it was calm and unremarkable, when my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I picked it up already knowing something was wrong. Emily never texted that late without a reason. "Mom, the porch light is broken." I stood there for exactly 3 seconds staring at those words. Then something in my chest went very still the way it used to before a mission briefing. That sentence wasn't about a light bulb. It was a code Emily and I built 3 years earlier, after a night when Daniel got so angry he smashed her phone against the kitchen wall. We agreed then, if she ever felt unsafe and couldn't say so directly, she'd send me that exact line. We never had to use it. Until now. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't send a panicked reply. I typed a single symbol back to Emily, our signal that I'd received it, and help was coming. And then I dialed 911. I gave the dispatcher the address, the custody order details, and Emily's last known location, speaking in the flat, clear voice I used to give coordinates under fire. My hands were steady. My mind was already 3 steps ahead. Let me back up because you need to understand what Daniel and I had become by that point. We'd been divorced 2 years. During our marriage, whenever I tried to talk about my work, he'd cut me off. "I don't care about your meetings and your paperwork," he used to say, waving a hand like I was boring him with grocery lists. Later, I heard him tell people at parties that I was basically a military secretary. I let him believe it. Some of what I did couldn't be discussed anyway, and honestly by then I'd stopped trying to correct him about anything. I'd learned that Daniel only respected things that made him money, or made him look good in front of other people. My service didn't fit either category, so in his mind it simply didn't exist. After I called the police, I grabbed a small bag I kept packed by the door, a habit from years of short-notice deployments, locked up, and got in the car. 9 minutes into the drive, my phone buzzed with a voice memo from Emily. 14 seconds long. I played it once, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, and heard Daniel's voice underneath hers, sharp and controlled, in a way I recognized too well. "You're going to sign this. Tonight, we're leaving the state." That wasn't a father losing his temper. That was a plan. I found out later what he was trying to force her to sign paperwork, transferring control of her college trust fund before our upcoming custody hearing. He wanted her out of Virginia before a judge could stop him. 15 minutes after that text landed, I turned onto his street and saw red and blue light bouncing off the tree line in front of his house. For half a second, relief hit me. The police had gotten there fast. Then I saw what was actually happening in his driveway, and the relief drained right out of me. His SUV was running, back doors open, the trunk stuffed with luggage. I parked at the curb, my heart hammering against my ribs even as my face stayed perfectly calm. 20 years of training doesn't disappear just because it's your own daughter in the driveway. I stepped out of the car exactly as Daniel yanked Emily by the arm toward the open door, and he spun toward the officers with his voice pitched, loud, and desperate. "That's her. That's my ex-wife. She's unstable. She's trying to kidnap our daughter." I stood there in the glow of the police lights, watching the man who once called me weak point his finger at me like I was the danger in this story. He had no idea how wrong he was about to be proven. I didn't run to Emily. Every part of me wanted to, but I'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to lose control of a dangerous situation is to act like you've already lost it. So I raised both hands. where the officers could see them, walked forward at a measured pace and introduced myself in a voice that didn't shake. Daniel didn't give me the chance to say much more than that. He talked over me loud and fast the way he always did when he sensed he was losing an audience. She's delusional. She uses her little military thing to intimidate this family, and she has no legal right to be here. This is my week with Emily. I didn't argue with him. Arguing was exactly what he wanted because it made the two of us look like equally unreliable narrators. Instead, I turned to the officer closest to me and handed over what I'd brought in that small bag by my door, the bag I kept ready for exactly this kind of night. A copy of our custody agreement, the screenshot of Emily's text, the voice memo of Daniel telling her to sign, and the court order dated 4 months earlier explicitly barring Daniel from removing Emily from the state without my written consent. He laughed short and sharp. She has this stuff ready because she's obsessed with controlling me, who keeps documents like that in their car. A mother who's learned not to trust him, I thought, but I didn't say it. I let the papers speak. Then Emily did something I hadn't expected. She stepped slightly away from her father and told the officers in a small but steady voice that he'd taken her phone and locked it in his desk, that he'd taken her passport out of the family safe, and that he'd threatened to send her to a boarding school in another state if she didn't sign the paper transferring her college trust fund into his name. The color left Daniel's face for just a second before he recovered it. One of the officers asked him to open the trunk. He hesitated half a breath too long before he did. Inside were 3 suitcases, Emily's passport, a thick envelope of cash, and a manila folder with my name printed across the tab in government type I recognized instantly. My stomach dropped. Those were old military documents of mine records that had gone missing from our shared storage, after the divorce records I'd assumed I'd simply misplaced during the move. "Those are joint property," Daniel said, already building his defense. "Everything from the marriage is joint property." I looked closer and saw a restricted access stamp on the folder's corner, the kind that meant this wasn't just old sentimental paperwork. I told the officer calmly but firmly not to open it and to contact the appropriate authority instead. Daniel rolled his eyes at me like I was performing a scene from a movie. "Come on, Sarah. You're not a spy. You're a tired mom who likes to make everything sound bigger than it is." I didn't answer him. There was nothing to gain from answering him, not in front of Emily, not in front of strangers with badges who didn't know either of us yet. Some things you let sit until they can be proven instead of argued. The officers moved Emily into my car for her safety. Daniel wasn't arrested that night. The documents needed verification. The custody violation needed review. But he was told in no uncertain terms that he wasn't taking her anywhere. On the drive home, Emily sat curled against the passenger door, arms wrapped around herself, shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Somewhere around the second red light, she told me in pieces that Daniel had spent weeks asking her questions about my military pay, my pension, and something he called a trust fund he swore I'd hidden from him. "He said you had millions of dollars you never told him about," she whispered. "He said I could help him get it back." I kept my eyes on the road and my voice level, but inside something clicked into place with a cold, clear certainty. This was never only about custody. Daniel wanted access to money, to my military records, to leverage he thought he could use against me. That night, Emily fell asleep on the living room couch, still in her jacket, one hand curled near her face, the way she used to sleep as a little girl. I sat in the chair across from her for a long time, watching her breathe, thinking about the years I'd spent married to a man who never once raised a hand to me, but who managed somehow to make me question my own reflection in the mirror. He called my silence weakness. He called my patience cowardice. Every time I pushed back, he twisted it into proof that I was the unstable one. I left that marriage without ever trying to hurt him. I told myself that was the mature thing to do, the thing that protected Emily best. But sitting there in the dark, watching my daughter's chest rise and fall, I understood that Daniel had just crossed a line there was no walking back from. My phone rang just after 7 the next morning. Marcus Reed's name lit up the screen, an old friend, an old teammate, someone who now worked in military investigations and rarely called before 9 unless something was wrong. "Sarah," he said, and his voice had none of its usual warmth. "Those documents he had in the car, they're not just personal records. There's one file in there that was never supposed to leave the archive. I gripped the phone tighter and asked Marcus what he meant. He told me to sit down first, which was never a good sign coming from a man who'd once briefed me on casualty reports without blinking. To understand what he told me that morning, you have to understand who I was before I became Daniel's ex-wife, or Emily's mom. I joined the Army at 22, young and restless, looking for something bigger than the small Ohio town I grew up in. I served in Germany, then Iraq, then Afghanistan before moving into intelligence work and crisis response planning. I wasn't the kind of soldier you see in movies kicking down doors. My strength was quieter than that, staying calm when everyone around me wanted to panic, gathering information other people missed, predicting what a threat would do 3 moves before it did it. Daniel and I met when I was already years into my career. He knew in the vaguest sense that I worked for the Army. He never asked more than that. Early on, when I tried to tell him about a difficult deployment or a decision that had kept me up at night, he'd cut me off before I finished the sentence. "I don't need the details," he'd say, already reaching for his phone. "Just tell me you're fine." So I stopped telling him anything. Some of what I did genuinely couldn't be shared, that part was real, but over time I let the silence become a habit rather than a necessity. I told myself it protected our marriage. Looking back, I think it protected me from watching him decide in real time that my work wasn't worth his attention. Marcus explained that the folder in Daniel's trunk appeared to be a copy of a security assessment from one of my earlier assignments. The tactical value of the information itself was outdated. He said nothing current or dangerous in the wrong hands. But unauthorized possession and duplication of that kind of document could still trigger a federal inquiry regardless of how old it was. I asked the obvious question. Why would Daniel want it? Marcus didn't know for certain, but I did almost instantly. Daniel wasn't planning to sell secrets. He was planning to use the appearance of secrecy to paint me in family court as a woman, with a hidden, unstable past, someone who trained her own daughter to use military code language against her father. That's when Helen Brooks called. Helen had been my attorney since the divorce, a woman in her mid-50s with a reputation for staying 3 steps ahead of difficult men in expensive suits. She told me Daniel had filed an emergency motion for full custody. In it, he claimed I had a history of classified missions, unresolved psychological trauma from combat, and that I had trained Emily to use coded distress signals, specifically to undermine his parental authority. He had taken the very system I built to keep our daughter safe and turned it into a weapon against me. "He doesn't need to prove you're dangerous," Helen said, her voice flat and practical over the phone. "He just needs to make the judge wonder." I understood exactly what she meant. In family court, doubt is often as effective as proof. I didn't call in any favors from the military to fight back. I built my case the way I built every operation for 20 years, methodically, with documentation, without emotion clouding the plan. Helen and I compiled the police report from that night. Emily's statement. Our family counseling records from the year prior. A letter from Emily's school documenting Daniel's attempt to unenroll her without my consent. Bank records tied to the college trust fund. The voice memo Emily had sent me. Emily, meanwhile, had grown quiet with guilt. She sat at my kitchen table one evening, picking at the edge of a napkin, and finally said what had clearly been eating at her for days. "This is my fault. If I hadn't sent that text, none of this would be happening." I sat down across from her and waited until she looked up at me. "You didn't cause any of this," I told her. "The code didn't create the danger. It just let us see danger that was already there." She didn't say anything, but her shoulders dropped an inch, like some of the weight had shifted off them. 2 days later, Helen called again, and this time there was an edge of excitement under her professional calm. While reviewing financial records for the custody case, her paralegal had found something neither of us expected. Nearly $80,000 had been withdrawn from an old joint business account Daniel and I technically still shared from before the divorce, and the money had been wired to a company registered under the name of his fiancée. The memo line on the transfer read simply, "Custody relocation expenses." I stared at the printout Helen emailed me for a long moment, feeling something shift from suspicion into certainty. This was never just about anger or control or even Emily. Daniel was drowning in something, and he thought I was his life raft. Helen and I spent the better part of a week tracing where Daniel's money had actually gone, and the picture that emerged was worse than either of us expected. Several of his real estate projects had collapsed. Loans were coming due he couldn't cover. His company was sliding toward bankruptcy quietly enough that most of his social circle had no idea. He believed apparently with total conviction that I was sitting on some hidden fortune, a military pension, a secret investment account, something substantial I'd tucked away during the divorce. The truth was far less dramatic, but still meaningful to him. A modest reserve pension, reasonable savings, and a college fund I'd built for Emily, one careful deposit at a time since she was 6 years old. Daniel wanted control of Emily specifically because it gave him a legal foothold to reach that fund. Once he realized the custody case might not go entirely his way, he shifted tactics. He started a quiet, methodical campaign to discredit me. He emailed several parents at Emily's school suggesting I struggled with post-traumatic stress. He called my unit commander directly accusing me of misusing military resources to surveil my own family. I was asked to report for an internal review. Daniel seemed to think this was his winning move. He called me the evening before the review, his voice light with something that sounded almost like triumph. "Finally," he said, "everyone's going to see who you really are." "I hope so," I told him and hung up. The review itself didn't rattle me the way he expected it to. I answered every question directly. I confirmed that yes, I had taught my daughter a distress phrase, and I explained exactly why the broken phone the year of escalating control, the night 3 years earlier that started all of it. My commanding officer confirmed I had never misused military resources or authority. If anything, the review turned its attention toward Daniel and the restricted documents found in his possession, which had already been flagged for a separate federal inquiry. Around that same time, Emily told me something new, her voice tight with a kind of shame she shouldn't have had to carry. Daniel had asked her more than once to record a video statement scripted, she said, though he called it "just talking naturally," in which she was supposed to say that I had frequent angry outbursts and that living with me frightened her. She told me she'd deliberately messed up the takes over and over, stalling for time she didn't fully understand she needed. Sitting across from her at the kitchen table, I realized this wasn't a man who'd snapped in a moment of panic. This was a campaign he'd been building for months, layer by layer, waiting for the right moment to use it. Helen warned me not to get comfortable. In custody cases, she said, a senior military officer composed disciplined, used to controlling her expression under pressure, can be twisted just as easily into the picture of a cold, emotionally unavailable mother. Daniel's attorney would try to make my calm look like evidence against me. "You can't walk into that courtroom as Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell," Helen told me. "You have to walk in as Emily's mother. Let the records prove the rest." I understood what she meant, though it sat uneasily with me. 20 years of training had taught me to lead with composure. Now I was being told composure itself might work against me. 2 nights before the hearing, my phone buzzed with an email from Daniel. I opened it standing in my kitchen and I read it twice to make sure I understood it correctly the first time. He proposed a deal. If I signed over half my military pension and gave up any claim to control of Emily's college fund, he would withdraw his petition for full custody. I read it a 3rd time, feeling something cold and clear settle over me. Not rage exactly, more like the quiet certainty I used to feel right before a plan came together. This wasn't a father protecting his daughter. This was a man trying to buy his way out of a financial hole, using our child as the currency. I forwarded the email to Helen without adding a single word of my own. She called me back within 10 minutes, and for the first time since this began, I heard something like satisfaction in her voice. "Sarah," she said, "this is the extortion evidence we've been missing." The courtroom was packed by the time our case was called, more people than I expected for a custody hearing. Co-workers of Daniel's, a few mutual friends who'd apparently chosen sides, and his fiancée sitting in the front row in a cream-colored dress that looked more suited to a gala than a family court. Daniel walked in wearing an expensive suit flanked by a well-known attorney, and he actually smiled at me across the room like the outcome had already been decided in his favor. I wore a simple gray blazer, nothing that announced rank or service. I'd thought about it the night before, standing in front of my closet with my dress uniform still hanging in its garment bag, and decided against it. I didn't want to win this by intimidating anyone. I wanted to win it with the truth. Daniel's attorney opened by painting a picture of me as secretive, controlling a woman quietly obsessed with danger that mostly existed in her own mind. He listed his points like bullet items on a slide. I had hidden my military career from my own husband. I had taught our daughter to use coded language against her father. I kept a firearm in my home. I had a background in intelligence work. And I had called the police within seconds of receiving an ambiguous text message which he framed as paranoid overreaction, rather than a mother recognizing a signal she and her daughter had built together. Daniel took the stand and testified that he'd only planned to take Emily on a weekend trip. The suitcases, he said, the passport, the cash, all coincidence, badly timed packing for a getaway that had nothing sinister behind it. When Helen asked about the document transferring control of Emily's college fund, he said he'd simply wanted to simplify the family's finances. Helen answered every claim with something solid in her hands. She entered our custody agreement, which explicitly barred him from removing Emily from the state without my written consent. She played the voice memo of Daniel telling Emily to sign the paperwork, his voice filling the courtroom sharper and colder than the version of himself sitting at the defense table. She submitted the email in which he offered to withdraw his custody petition in exchange for half my pension. Then Emily was called to speak with the judge privately away from both of us, and I watched Daniel's composure start to crack for the first time all day. When Emily returned to the courtroom, he leaned toward me, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "You turned her against me." "You did that yourself," I said, and didn't look at him again. His attorney made one more attempt, turning toward my service record, suggesting combat experience might have left me unstable, unpredictable, unfit to parent alone. Helen let him finish, then turned to me with a single simple line of questioning. "In 20 years of service, were you ever disciplined for losing control? Never. Were you ever found unfit for duty? No. What did you do the moment you received that text from your daughter?" "I called the police. I didn't threaten Daniel. I didn't break into the house. I didn't handle it myself." That answer landed differently than anything else said that day. It made clear something Daniel had never understood about me. My training didn't make me dangerous. It taught me exactly when not to use my own strength. Just as it seemed the worst of it had passed, Helen walked to the evidence table and lifted a small USB drive, holding it up for the judge to see. She explained that it contained a video Emily had secretly recorded and saved months earlier, something she'd never told either of us about until the week before trial. The clerk loaded the file. Daniel's voice filled the courtroom again, this time from a recording he clearly never expected to surface. "Once I have custody," his recorded voice said flat and certain, "I control everything in her name. Your mother's going to have to pay if she wants to see you again." The video changed the air in that courtroom instantly. I felt it before I even looked at Daniel, the shift in the room, the way the judge's expression hardened, the way his own attorney went very still beside him. Daniel insisted the recording had been edited, cut, and spliced to twist his meaning. But the forensic analyst Helen had brought in confirmed the file was untouched, original time-stamped months before our hearing. There was nowhere left for him to stand. Helen kept going, laying out the rest of what her team had uncovered in the days before trial. An enrollment application at a private school in Tennessee submitted under Emily's name, a 3-month lease agreement for an apartment outside Nashville, a backup flight reservation booked for 2 passengers, 1 adult and 1 minor, documents for a new bank account opened in Emily's name, one I had never been told about and never consented to. And finally, an email exchange between Daniel and his fiancée discussing how to make Sarah pay to get her back, written in language that left no real room for interpretation. Then came the moment I hadn't fully prepared for. A federal investigator present at the request of the court confirmed that Daniel was under active review for unauthorized possession of restricted military documents. The judge made clear this custody hearing wouldn't rule on any federal matter directly, but the fact itself gutted Daniel's earlier claim that he'd simply grabbed old paperwork by accident during a move. There was nothing accidental about any of it, and everyone in that room now understood that. Daniel finally lost whatever composure he'd been holding on to. He stood up fast enough that his chair scraped loudly against the floor, and he pointed at me across the room, his voice cracking with something between fury and panic. "She hid everything from me. I was married to a woman I didn't even know." I looked at him steadily, no rush in my voice at all. "You never wanted to know me," I said. "You only ever wanted to know what you could get from me." He tried one last angle, mocking my rank, claiming I only used it to intimidate people, that the uniform was a costume I hid behind. The judge, who had been quiet through most of the outburst, asked me directly why I'd spent so many years letting Daniel describe me as a weak, powerless woman without ever correcting him. I thought about that question for a moment before I answered. Because I never needed him to see me clearly, I said. I only needed my daughter to be safe. The judge didn't take long after that. He suspended Daniel's unsupervised visitation, immediately granted me primary custody, and issued an order barring Daniel from removing Emily from the county without court approval. Access to Emily's college fund was frozen, pending the outcome of the financial investigation already underway. Daniel didn't fall because I overpowered him. He fell because every lie he told eventually landed in front of someone who was quietly writing it all down, waiting for the moment it would matter. As Emily and I walked out of the courtroom, her hand finding mine the way it hadn't in months, I saw two men in dark suits waiting near the far end of the hallway. One of them stepped forward as Daniel came through the doors behind us, holding up a badge. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice even and unhurried. "We need to speak with you about some documents found in your vehicle." I didn't look back to see Daniel's face. I didn't need to. Emily's fingers tightened around mine, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, we walked toward the exit without either of us looking over our shoulder. A few months passed before life started to feel steady again. Daniel accepted a plea agreement on several financial charges and unauthorized possession of restricted documents, avoiding more serious consequences in exchange for full cooperation. He lost control of Emily's college fund, entirely faced significant fines, and was allowed to see her only under supervision. His company folded not long after. His fiancée left him once she discovered how deeply her name had been used in his financial schemes without her knowledge. I didn't celebrate his collapse. There was no satisfaction in watching a man's life fall apart, even a man who'd tried to take my daughter and my dignity in the same breath. What I felt instead was relief. The specific quiet relief of a door finally closing on something that had been open far too long. Emily started therapy that spring and returned to school with a lighter step than I'd seen in her in years. One evening, sitting on my bedroom floor while I sorted through an old trunk, she asked me a question that had clearly been building for a while. "Why did you never tell me about the missions, the medals, any of it?" I didn't answer right away. I opened the trunk instead, lifting out photographs, folded letters, a small velvet box holding service medals she'd never seen. Her eyes went wide as she sifted through them piece by piece, slowly understanding that her mother had once commanded hundreds of soldiers, had once carried responsibilities most people couldn't imagine. "Why did you let Dad think you were weak?" she asked quietly. "Strength doesn't disappear just because someone else refuses to see it," I told her. A few weeks later, my unit held a ceremony, and for the first time, Emily watched me stand in full dress uniform, my rank insignia catching the light. Young soldiers straightened to attention as I walked past. Daniel had spent years believing my silence meant fear. Emily, standing beside me that day, finally understood it had always been discipline. That night, we sat on the porch together and talked about the code we'd built 3 years earlier, the phrase that started all of this. I told her we might never need it again. She said she wanted to keep it anyway, not as a reminder of the night her father nearly took her from me, but as a reminder that when she spoke up, I listened and I came. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't have explained to you at the start of this story. My ex-husband spent our entire marriage believing I was a fragile woman who happened to wear a uniform. He never asked what those 20 years actually taught me: how to walk into chaos without letting fear make my decisions for me, how to wait, watch, and gather what I needed before I ever moved. The night my daughter sent me 4 quiet words about a broken porch light. I didn't need to prove I was a soldier. I only needed to do what any mother would do. 15 minutes later, standing in that driveway under the flashing lights, Daniel finally understood something he'd missed for years. My silence was never surrender. It was patience, waiting for the moment truth could speak louder than he ever could. Emily and I are doing well now. We have a small, steady life, one built on trust instead of fear. And some nights I still catch her glancing toward the porch light before she goes to bed, not out of worry anymore, but out of habit, the kind of habit that reminds you how far you've come. I want to know what you think happens to people like Daniel once the truth finally catches up to them. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I love hearing from you. We share stories like this one every single day, so if this touched you, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. Let's keep going together.